obviously I'm going to be starting work at IKEA, 10-hour shifts from 4 in the afternoon to 2:30 in the morning. Um, so that's going to be my new job starting in the next week or two. But today we're going to talk about my favorite baseball team, the Chicago Cubs. I grew up in Chicago, so it's not uncommon to either be a Cubs or a Sox fan. I've never been a Sox fan. I grew up on the north side, so of course that's where the Cubs play, and of course I got to support that team because I grew up on the north side. Um, so the Chicago Cubs are an American professional baseball team that are based in Chicago, Illinois. Um, Now the Cubs compete in Major League Baseball as a member club of the National League Central Division. The Cubs play its home games at Wrigley Field, which has been around for years. Wrigley Field's been around 100 years, if not longer, which is located on Chicago's north side. They are one of the two Major League teams based in Chicago, alongside the American League's Chicago White Sox. Um, the Cubs, when they first came into existence in 1870, were known as the White Stockings. And they were founded in 1870 and are one of two remaining National League charter franchises that debuted in 1876. And they have been known as the Cubs since 1903, when they decided to basically make that team name permanent. So from 1871 to 1875, the Cubs played in the National Association, and then in 1876 they switched over to the National League, and they've been in the National League since 1876. And then from 1969 to 1993, they played in the Eastern Division. And then from 1994 until now, they've been in the Central Division since then. The Cubs have only had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 members retired. So on the Cubs, the retired numbers are 10, 14, 20, 23, 26, 31, and 32. 31's on there twice. I don't know why. 42, I can understand that number because that was Jackie Robinson's number, and every team in baseball retired it so that nobody else can play it or use it anyway at all. Now, throughout the club's history, the Cubs have played in a total of 11 World Series, only winning 3 of those. The 1906 Cubs won 116 games, finishing 116-36, and posting a modern era record winning percentage of 76%. But they lost the World Series to the Chicago White Sox, known as the Hitless Wonders, that year because they weren't very good at hitting back then, by 4-2. But the Cubs will win back-to-back World Series in 1907 and 1908 before becoming the first Major League team to play in 3 consecutive World Series and the first to win it twice. Most recently, the Cubs won the 2016 National League World Championship Series and the 2016 World Series, which ended a 71-year National League pennant drought and a 108-year World Series championship drought, both of which are record droughts in Major League Baseball. Now, the 108-year drought has also been the longest such occurrence in all major professional sports leagues in the United States and Canada. But since the start of divisional play in 1969, the Cubs have appeared in the postseason 11 times through the 2024 season. So the Cubs have played at many different ballparks. Nicknames that the Cubs go by are the Cubbies, the Northsiders, the Northside Nine, the Boys in Blue, and the Lovable Losers. Just like Brooklyn Dodgers were known as the Brooklyn Bums as a nickname. So since the Cubs started playing in 1871, they started off being known as the Sox from 1871 to 1889. And then in 1890, they switched over to using the name Colts from 1890 to 1897. And then in 1898, they switched over to using the name Chicago Orphans. And then since 1903, they've been using the name Chicago Cubs since then, which sounds a lot better. They've been playing at Wrigley Field since 1916, but they started off playing at Ogden Park and Dexter Park in 1870. Back then, they didn't have a lot of baseball stadiums to really play at. And then in 1871, they played at Lake Park. There really isn't anything listed for 1872 to 1873, but there is something from 1874 where they played at 23rd Street grounds, and then they had a Lakefront Park 1 and 2. They played at Lakefront Park, the first one in 1878 to 1882. In 1883, they switched over to Lakefront Park from 1883 to 1884. And then they had Westside Park from 1885 to 1891, and then Southside Park from 1891 to 1893. And then from 1893 to up until 1915, they played on the west side, before switching over to Wrigley Field in 1916. The Cubs have won 17 pennants, along with 3 World Series rings. They won the 3 World Series in 1907, 1908, and 2016. Um, the last National League pennant they won was 2016. Now, okay, so in the early history of the Chicago Cubs, the Chicago Cubs began playing in 1870 as the Chicago White Sox, playing their home games on the West Side grounds. Now, 6 years later, they joined the National League as a charter member team. In the run-up to the National League, gotta try to put this up here. Now, in the run-up to their National League debut, owner William Holbert, who was the first owner of the Cubs, signed various star players, such as Albert Spalding and infielders Russ Bronson, Deacon White, and the Cap Anson, who was a racist bastard anyway. The White Sox quickly established themselves as one of the new league's top team members. Spalding only won 47 games, and Barnes led the league in hitting at 429, and Chicago won the first National League pennant, which at the time was the game's top prize. Back then, I don't think they had World Series back then in the 1800s. Now, after winning back-to-back pennants in 1880 and 1881, Holbert died, and Spalding, who had retired from playing to start Spalding's sporting records, assumed ownership of the club. Now, the White Sox, with Anson acting as player-manager back then, which they don't really have anymore, captured their third consecutive pennant in 1882. And Anson himself established himself as the game's first true superstar. In 1885 and 1886, after winning National League pennants, the White Sox met the championships of the short-lived American Association in that era's version of a World Series. Both seasons resulted in matchups with the St. Louis Stockings, which they don't exist anymore, and the Cubs tied in 1885. Yeah, that does happen. The Cubs tied in 1885, and the St. Louis won it in 1886. Now, this was the genesis of what would eventually become one of the greatest rivalries in sports history. There's a lot of sports teams that do have rivalries with each other. In all, the Anson-led Chicago baseball club won 6 National League pennants between 1876 and 1886. By 1890, the team had become known as the Chicago Colts, or sometimes known as Anson's Colts, referring to Cap's influence within the club. Anson was the first player in history credited with 3,000 career hits, but in 1897, after a disappointing record of a 59-73 and a 9th place finish, Anson was released by the club as both a player and a manager. His departure after 22 years led local newspaper reporters to refer to Colts as the Orphans. After the 1900 season, the American Baseball League formed as a rival professional league. The club's old White Stockings nickname, eventually shortened to White Sox, was adopted by a new American League neighborhood to the south side. Now, in 1902, Spalding, who by this time had revamped the roster to boast what would soon be one of the best baseball teams of the early of the team's early roster, and the early century, sold the club to Jim Hart, referencing the youth of the team's roster. The Chicago Daily News called the franchise the Cubs in 1902, and officially took the name 5 years later. And during this time period, which has become known as baseball's dead ball era, which back then they didn't hit a lot of homers. That's what dead ball meant. Cubs infielders Joe Tinker, Johnny Evers, and Frank Chance were made famous as a double play combination by Franklin P. Adams' poem "Baseball Said Lexicon." The poem first appeared in the July 18, 1910 edition of the New York Evening Mail. Mordecai Three Finger Brown, Jack Taylor, Ed Reelbach. I don't know what would be considered the Chicago Dog. Jack Feister and Orville Overall were several key pitchers for the Cubs during that time period. Now, with Frank Chance acting as player manager from 1905 to 1912, the Cubs won 4 pennants and 2 World Series titles over a 5-year span. Although they fell to the hitless wonders, which were known as the Sox, in the 1906 World Series. The Cubs recorded a record 116 victories that year, and the best winning percentage, which was 76.3%, which was a 763 winning percentage. In Major League history, with mostly the same roster, Chicago Cubs would win back-to-back World Series in 1907 and 1908, becoming the first Major League club to play 3 times in the Fall Classic, and the first to win it back-to-back. After the 1908 World Series, the Cubs would not win another one until 2016, and at that time remained the longest championship drought in North American history. Yeah, I know. I've been getting sick. It's around that time. This is winter time. Everybody's going to be getting sick. Um, the next um, the next season, veteran catcher Johnny Kling had left the team to become a professional pocket sports billiard player. Um, some historians think that Kling's absence was significant enough to prevent the Cubs from also winning a third straight title in 1909, as they finished 6 games out of first place. When Kling returned the next year, the Cubs won the pennant again, but they would lose the 1910 World Series to Philadelphia Athletics. Um, In 1914, advertising executive Albert Lasker obtained a large block of the club's shares, and before the 1916 season, they assumed a majority ownership of that franchise. Now, Lasker brought a wealthy partner, Charles Wiegum, the proprietor of a popular chain of lunch counters, who had previously owned the Chicago Whales of the short-lived Federal League. The Federal League does not exist anymore in baseball. As principal owners, the pair moved the club from the West Side grounds to the much newer Wiegum Park, which had been constructed for the Whales only 2 years earlier, where they remain to this day. Now, the Cubs responded by winning a pennant in the war-shortened season of 1918, where they played a part in another team's curse. The Boston Red Sox defeated Grover Cleveland Alexander's Cubs 4 games to 2 in the 1918 World Series, and Boston's last series championship was in 2004, when they would win again. Um, Now, beginning in 1916, Bill Wrigley of the chewing gum fame acquired an increasing quantity of stock in the Cubs, and by 1921 he was the majority owner of the team. Now, meanwhile, Bill Vick Sr. began his tenure as a team president in 1919, and Vick would hold that post throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. Now, the management of team of Wrigley and Vick became to be known as the Double Bills. Um, Yeah, I gotta go back to a Cubs game sometime in the next year or so when I get some money saved. It's been a long time since I've been to one. Um, Now, near the end of the first decade of the Double Bills guidance, the Cubs won the National League pennant in 1929, and then they achieved the unusual feat of winning a pennant every 3 years, following up the 1929 flag with league titles in 32, 35, and 38. Now, their success did not extend to the Fall Classic, as they fell to their American League rivals each time. Um, Now, the 32 series against the Yankees featured Babe Ruth's so-called shot at Wrigley Field in the Game 3, and there were some historic moments for the Cubs as well. In 1930, Hack Wilson, one of the top home run hitters in the time, had one of the most impressive seasons in MLB. Um, in MLB history. During that year, he hit 56 homers, and he established the current runs batted in record of 191. That 1930 club, which boasted 6 eventual Hall of Famers, which was Hack Wilson, Gabby Hartnett, Roger Hornsby, George Kelly, Kiki Kyler, and manager Joe McCarthy, established the current team batting average record of 309. In 1935, the Cubs claimed the pennant in thrilling fashion, winning a record 21 games in a row in September. The 38 club saw Dizzy Dean lead the team's pitching staff and provided a historic moment when they won a crucial late season game at Wrigley Field over the Pittsburgh Pirates with a walk-off home run by Gabby Hartnett, which became known as in baseball lore as the Homer and the Glowman. If you don't know what Hack Wilson looks like, this is what he looks like. He was one of the most power hitters back then on the Cubs before Babe Ruth. And this is around the time that Babe Ruth came along. Um, after the Double Bills, which was Bill Wrigley and Vick, they both died in 1932 and 33 respectively, and then P.K. Wrigley, who was the son of Bill Wrigley, took over as the majority owner of the Cubs. He was unable to extend his father's baseball success beyond 1938, and the Cubs would slip into years of mediocrity. Through although the Wrigley family would retain control of the team until they sold ownership in 1981. Um, There was the curse of 1945. The Cubs enjoyed winning one more pennant at the close of World War II, finishing 98 and 56 due to the wartime travel restrictions. The first three games of the 1945 World Series were played in Detroit, where the Cubs would win two games, including the one-hitter by Claude Vassell, and the final four were played at Wrigley. The Cubs lost the series and did not return into the 2016 World Series after losing the 1945 World Series to the Detroit Tigers. The Cubs finished with a respectable 82 and 71 record in the following year, but this was only good enough for third place. Here's a sports-related curse called the Billy Goat Tavern, because in the 1940s, a guy tried to get into Wrigley Field with his goat. Cubs wouldn't let him, and so supposedly he put a curse on the Cubs, saying that they would never win another World Series again while he was alive, and they didn't until 2016. But this is a dedication to the thing. Now, in the following 2 decades, the Cubs played mostly forgettable baseball, finishing among the worst teams in the National League on an almost annual basis. From 1947 to 1966, they only notched a one-winning season. Longtime infielder manager Phil Cabarretta, who had been a key player during the 1945 season, was fired during spring training in 1954 after admitting the team was unlikely to finish above 5th place. Although shortstop Ernie Banks would become one of the star players in that time, and finding help for him proved a difficult task, as quality players such as Hank Sauer were few and far between, and this combined with poor ownership decisions such as the colleges of coaches, and the ill-fated trade of future Hall of Famer Lou Brock to the St. Louis Cocksuckers for pitcher Only Broglio, who only won 7 games over the next 3 seasons, hampered his on-field performance. In the 1960s, the late 1960s brought hope of a renaissance, with third baseman Ron Santo, pitcher Fergie Jenkins, and outfielder Billy Williams joining Ernie Banks. After losing a dismal 103 games in 1966, the Cubs brought home consecutive winning records in 67 and 68, marking the first time a Cubs team had accomplished that feat in over 2 decades. In 1969, the Cubs, managed by Leo DeRuscher, built a substantial lead in the newly created National League Eastern Division. By mid-August, Ken Holtzman pitched a no-hitter on August 19th, and the division lead grew to 8.5 games over the St. Louis Cocksuckers, and by 9.5 games over the New York Mets. After the game of September 2nd, the Cubs' record was 84 and 52, with the Mets in second place at 77 and 55. But then, a losing streak began just as Mets' winning streak was beginning. The Cubs lost the final game of a series in Cincinnati, and then they came home to play the resurgent Pittsburgh Pirates, who would finish in third place. After losing the first 2 games by a score of 9-2 and 13-4, the Cubs had led going into the 9th inning. But a win would be a positive springboard, since the Cubs were to play a crucial series with the Mets the next day. But Willie Stargell drilled a 2-out, 2-strike pitch from the Cubs' ace reliever Phil Reagan onto Sheffield Avenue to tie the score in the top of the 9th. And the Cubs would end up losing 7-5 in extra innings, which is common. Now, burdened by a 4-game losing streak, the Cubs traveled to Shea Stadium for a short 2-game set. The Mets would win both games, and the Cubs left New York with a record of 84 and 58. Just a half game out in front, but more of the same followed in Philadelphia, as a 99-loss Phillies team nonetheless defeated the Cubs twice to extend Chicago's losing streak to 8 games. But in a key play in the second game on September 11th, the Cubs starter Dick Selma threw a surprise pickoff attempt to third baseman Ron Santo, who was nowhere near the bag at the time. Now, Selma's throwing error opened the gates to a Phillies rally, but after that second Philly loss, the Cubs were 84 and 60, and the Mets had pulled ahead at 85 and 57. The Mets would not look back, and the Cubs' 8-game losing streak finally ended the next day in St. Louis, but the Mets were in the midst of a 10-game winning streak, and the Cubs' team fatigue generally deteriorated at all phases of the game won, and the Mets, who had lost a record of 120 games 7 years earlier, would go on to win the World Series, and the Cubs, despite a respectable 92-70 record, would be remembered for having lost a remarkable 17.5 games in the standings to the Mets in the last quarter of the century of that season. Now, following the 1969 season, the Cubs posted winning records for the next few seasons, but no playoff action. After the core players of those teams started to move on, the team declined during the 1970s, and they became known as the Lovable Losers, which would become a long-standing moniker for the team. In 1977, the team found some life, but they ultimately experienced a big collapse. The Cubs hit a high water mark on June 28th at 47-22, boasting an 8.5 game National League East lead, as they were led by Bobby Mercer with 27 homers and 89 RBIs. And Rick Merschel, a pitcher who had 20 wins and 10 losses at that time. Now, however, the Philadelphia Phillies cut the lead by 2 during the All-Star break as the Cubs sat 19 games over 500, but they swooned late in the season, going 20-40. After July 31st, the Cubs finished in fourth place at 81-81, while Philadelphia surged, finishing with 101 wins. Now, the following 2 seasons saw the Cubs get off to a fast start as the team rallied to over 10 games above 500, well into both seasons, only to again wear down and play poorly later on, and ultimately settling back into mediocrity. Now, this trait is known as the June swoon. Again, the Cubs' unusually high number of day games is often pointed to as one reason for the team's inconsistent late season play, because they do play a lot of day games. Now, P.K. Wrigley died in 1977, and his family took over, and they would own the Cubs until 1981, until they sold it to the Chicago Tribune for $20.5 million, ending the family's 65-year ownership with the team. Now here is Ryne Sandberg, who actually was not a bad player on the Cubs. Ryne Sandberg died last year from cancer. And he was elected to the Hall of Fame in 2005, just after he retired until 1997. After over a dozen more subpar seasons, the 1981 Cubs hired general manager Dallas Green from Philadelphia to turn around the franchise. Green had managed the 1980 Phillies to the World Series title, and one of his early general managing moves brought in a young Phillies minor league third baseman named Ryne Sandberg, along with Larry Bowa for Ivan De Jesus. Now, the 1983 Cubs had finished 71-91 under Lee, who was fired before the season ended by Green. And Green continued the culture of change and overhauled the Cubs roster, front office, and coaching staff prior to 1984. Jim Frey was hired to manage the 1984 Cubs with Don Zimmer coaching third base and Billy Connors serving as pitching coach. Now, Green shored up the 1984 roster with a series of transactions. In December of 1983. Scott Sanderson was acquired from Montreal on a 3-team deal with San Diego for Carmelo Martinez, pinch hitter Richie Hebner, who had a .333 batting average in 1984, and was signed as a free agent. In spring training, moves continued with left fielder Gary Matthews and center fielder Bobby Dernier came in from Philadelphia on March 26 for Bill Campbell and a minor leaguer. Now, reliever Tim Stoddard, 10-6 with .382 and 7 saves, was acquired the same day for a minor leaguer, and veteran pitcher Fergie Jenkins was released. The team's commitment to contend was complete when Green made a mid-season deal on June 15th to shore up the starting rotation due to injuries. Due to injuries to Rick Russo, who was 5-5, and Scott Sanderson. The deal brought 1979 National League Rookie of the Year pitcher Rick Sutcliffe from the Indians, and Joe Carter, who was with AAA Iowa Cubs at the time, and right fielder Mel Howell were sent to Cleveland for Sutcliffe and backup catcher Ron Hassey, who had a .333 batting average in 1984. Sutcliffe was 5-5 with the Indians. Immediately joined Sanderson, who was 8-5, and Eckersley 10-8. Steve Trout was 13-7, and Dick Ruthin was 6-10 in the starting rotation. Sutcliffe proceeded to go 16-1 for the Cubs and got the Cy Young Award that year. Now, the Cubs' 1984 starting lineup season was very strong, and it consisted of Gary Matthews, Sr., catcher Jody Davis, a right fielder Keith Moreland, shortstop Larry Bowa, first baseman Leon Bull Durham, center fielder Bob center fielder Dernier, third baseman Ron Cey, closer Lee Smith, and the 1984 National League MVP Ryne Sandberg. The reserve backup players were Richie Hebner, Thad Bosley, Henry Cotto, Ron Hassey, and Dave Owen, and they produced exciting moments. The bullpen depth of Rich Bordy George Frazier, Warren Brustar, and Dick Knowles did their job in getting the game to either Smith or Stoddard. At the top of the order, Denier and Sandberg were excited up after they coined the daily double by Harry Carey. With strong defense, Denier, the center fielder, and Sandberg, the second baseman, won the National League Gold Glove, solid pitching and clutch hitting. And the Cubs were a well-balanced team, but following the daily double, Matthews, Durham, Say, and Moreland and Davis gave the Cubs an order with no gaps to pitch around. Sutcliffe anchored a strong top to bottom bolt rotation, and Smith was one of the top closers in the game at that time before his records were broken by Trevor Hoffman and Mariano Rivera. Now the shift in the Cubs fortunes were characterized on June 23rd, which is my birthday, on the NBC Saturday Game of the Week contest against the St. Louis Cocksuckers, and has since been dubbed simply the Sandberg Game. With the nation watching and Wrigley Field packed, Sandberg emerged as a superstar, but not just one, but two game-tying homers against the Cocksuckers closer Bruce Sutter. Now, with his shots in the 9th and 10th innings, Wrigley Field erupted, and Sandberg set the stage for a comeback win that cemented the Cubs as the team to beat in the East, and no one could catch them at that time before they fell apart again. In early August, the Cubs swept the Mets in a four-game home series that further distanced them from the pack. Infamous Keith Moreland and Lynch fight erupted after Lynch hit Moreland with a pitch, perhaps forgetting that Moreland was once a linebacker at the University of Texas and that he knew how to kick ass. It was the second game of a doubleheader, and the Cubs had won the first game in part due to a 3-run home run by Moreland. After the bench-clearing brawl, the Cubs won the second game, and the sweep put the Cubs at 68-45 for the record during that year. In 1984, each league had won two divisions, East and West, and the divisional winners met in a best of a 5-game series to advance to the World Series in a 2-3 format. And the first two games they were played at home at the home of the team who did not have home field advantage. Usually, the team that does not have home field advantage, they play the game 0, and then the team that has home field advantage will get like 3 or 4 games there. The first two games were played at the home of the team who did not have home field advantage, but then the next 3 games were played at the home of the team who did have home field advantage. Plus, the first 2 games were played at Wrigley Field, and the next 3 at the home of their opponents, San Diego Padres. A common and unfounded myth is that since Wrigley Field did not have lights at that time, the National League decided to give the home field advantage to the winner of the National League West. Now, in fact, home field advantage had rotated between the winners of the East and West since 1969 when the league expanded. In an even-numbered years, the National League West had home field advantage, and odd-numbered years, the National League East had home field advantage. But since the National League East winners had home field advantage in 1983, the National League West winners were entitled to it. Now, the confusion may stem from the fact that Major League Baseball did not decide that, but should the Cubs make it to the World Series, the American League winner would have home field advantage. At the time, all home field advantages were rotated between each league. Odd-numbered years, the American League had home field advantage. Even-numbered years, the National League had home field advantage. But in 1982, World Series, in the 1982 World Series, the St. Louis Cocksuckers of the National League had home field advantage. And in the 1983 World Series, the Baltimore Orioles of the American League had home field advantage, and that's when they had Cal Ripken Jr. In the National League Championship Series, the Cubs easily won the first 2 games at Wrigley Field against the San Diego Padres. The Padres were the winners of the Western Division with Steve Garvey, Tony Gwynn, Eric Show, Goose Gossage, and Alan Wiggins. With wins of 13-0 and 4-2, the Cubs needed to win only 1 game of the next 3 in San Diego to make it to the World Series. After being beaten in Game 3, 7-1, the Cubs lost Game 4 when Smith, with the game tied 5-5, allowed the game-winning home run to Garvey in the bottom of the 9th inning. Now in Game 5, the Cubs took a 3-0 lead into the 6th inning and a 3-2 lead into the 7th with Sutcliffe, who won the Cy Young Award that earlier that year, still on the mound. Then Leon Durham had a sharp grounder hit to him go under his glove. This critical error helped the Padres win the game 6-3 with a 4-run 7th inning and keep the Cubs out of the 1984 World Series against the Detroit Tigers. The loss ended a spectacular season for the Cubs, one that brought alive a slumbering franchise and made the Cubs relevant for a whole new generation of Cubs fans. Now the Padres would end up losing to Sparky Anderson's Tigers in the Detroit in 5 games to the Sparky Anderson's Detroit Tigers in the World Series. In the 1985 season, it brought high hopes. The club started out going 35-19 through mid-June, but injuries to Sutcliffe and others in the pitching staff contributed to a 13-game losing streak that pushed the Cubs out of contention. Here's a picture of Andre Dawson on the field in 1987. Andre Dawson had a big contract with the Cubs that he signed, and he was there for 6 years, I think, before retiring in 1996. In 1989, the first full season with night baseball at Wrigley Field, Don Zimmer's Cubs were led by a core group of veterans in Ryan Sandberg, Rick Sutcliffe, and Andre Dawson, and they were also boasted by a crop of youngsters such as Mark Grace, Sean Dunston, Greg Maddux, Rookie of the Year Jerome Moulton, and Rookie of the Year runner-up Dwight Smith. The Cubs won the National League East once again that season, winning 93 games, and this time the Cubs met with San Francisco Giants in the National League Championship Series. After splitting the first 2 games at home, the Cubs headed to San Francisco, where despite holding a lead at some point in each of the next 3 games, bullpen meltdowns and managerial blunders ultimately led to 3 straight losses. Now the Cubs could not overcome the efforts of Will Clark, whose home run off of Maddux just after a managerial visit to the mound led Maddux to think that Clark knew what pitch was coming. Afterward, Greg Maddux would speak into his glove. Greg Maddux would speak into his glove during any mound conversation, beginning what is a normal today. Mark Grace was 11-17 in the series with 8 RBIs. Eventually, the Giants lost to the Bash Brothers and the Oakland A's in the infamous Earthquake Series. Here's a picture of Sammy Sosa, who was a steroid user before being traded. There's Sammy Sosa batting with the Cubs back then. Now, the 1998 season began on a somber note with the death of Cubs broadcaster Harry Caray. After the retirement of Ryan Sandberg and the trade of Sean Dunston, the Cubs had major holes to fill, and the signing of Henry Rodriguez to bat cleanup provided protection for Sammy Sosa in the lineup. As Rodriguez slugged 31 homers in his first season as a Cub. Now, Kevin Tapani led the club with a career-high 19 wins, while Ron Beck anchored a strong bullpen, and Mark Grace turned into one of his best seasons. The Cubs were swept by media attention in 1998, and the team's 2 biggest headliners were Sosa and rookie flamethrower Kerry Wood, who would never have the success that everyone hoped for. Wood's signature performance in baseball was one hitting the Houston Astros, a game in which he tied the Major League Baseball record of striking out 20 batters in 9 innings. His torrid strikeout numbers earned Wood the nickname Kid K, and ultimately earned him the 1998 National League Rookie of the Year award. Sosa caught fire in June, hitting a Major League record of 20 homers in that month, and his home run race with Cardinals slugger Mark McGwire transformed the pair into International League superstars in a matter of weeks. McGwire would finish the season with a new Major League record of 70 homers, which has since been beaten by Barry Bonds with 73, but Sosa's .308 average and 66 homers earned him the National League MVP award. Now, after a down-to-the-wire wild card chase with the San Francisco Giants, Chicago and San Francisco ended the regular season tied, and thus squared off in the one-game playoff at Wrigley Field. Third baseman Gary Gaetti hit the eventual game-winning homer in the playoff series, but the win propelled the Cubs into the postseason for the first time since 1989, with a 90-73 regular season record. The bats went cold in October as manager Jim Riggleman's club batted .183 and scored only 4 runs en route to being swept by Atlanta in the National League Division Series. The home run chase between Sosa, McGwire, and Ken Griffey Jr. helped professional baseball to bring in a new crop of fans, as well as bringing back some fans who were disillusioned by the 1994 baseball strike. The Cubs retained many players who experienced career years in 1998, but after a fast start in 1999, they collapsed again, starting with being swept in the hands of the crosstown White Sox in mid-June, and finished at the bottom of the division for the next 2 years. Um, in 2001, despite losing fan favorite Mark Grace to free agency and the lack of production from newcomer Todd Hundley, the baseball manager Don Baylor, Cubs put together a good season in 2001, but the season started with Mac Newton being brought in to preach positive thinking. One of the biggest stories of the season transpired as the Cubs made a midseason deal for Fred McGriff, which was drawn out for nearly a month as McGriff debated waiving his no-trade clause. The Cubs led the wild card race by 2.5 games in early September, but they crumbled when Preston Wilson hit a three-run walk-off homer off a closer, Tom Gordon, which halted the team's momentum. Now, the team was unable to make another series charge, and they finished the season at 88-74, 5 games behind both Houston and St. Louis, who tied for first. Sosa had perhaps his finest season, and John Lieber led the staff with the 21 season. Now, the Cubs had high expectations in 2002, but the squad played poorly. On July 5th of 2002, the Cubs promoted assistant general manager and player and personal director Jim Hendry to the general manager position. The club responded by hiring Dusty Baker and by making some major moves in 2003. Most notably, they traded with the Pittsburgh Pirates for outfielder Kenny Lofton and third baseman Aramis Ramirez, and they rode dominant pitching led by Kerry Wood and Mark Fire as the Cubs led the division down the stretch. And Mark Fire did not have the success as everyone hoped for either, and neither did Kerry Wood. Now, Chicago halted the St. Louis Cocksuckers' run to the playoffs by taking 4 or 5 games from the Cocksuckers at Wrigley Field in early September, after which they won the first division title in 14 years. Now, they then went on to defeat the Atlanta Braves in the dramatic 5-game division series, the franchise's first postseason World Series win since beating the Detroit Tigers in the 1908 World Series. Oh shit, fucker. Okay. After losing an extra inning game in Game 1, the Cubs rallied and took a 3-games-to-1 lead over the wild card Florida Marlins in the National League Championship Series. Now, Florida shut the Cubs out of Game 5, but the Cubs returned home to Wrigley Field with young pitcher Mark Fire to lead the Cubs in Game 6 as they took a 3-0 lead into the 8th inning. It was at this point when a now infamous incident took place. Several spectators attempted to catch a foul ball off the bat of Luis Castillo, who was at the time a Chicago Cubs fan by the name of Steve Bartman of Northbrook, Illinois, reached out over the wall for the ball and deflected it away from the glove of Moises Alou for the second out of the 8th inning. Alou reacted angrily toward the stands and after the game stated that he would have caught the ball. Alou at one point recanted, saying he would not have been able to make the play, but later said that this was just an attempt to make Bartman feel better and believing the whole incident should be forgotten, which nobody could forget that. Interference was not called on the play as the ball was ruled to be on the spectator side of the wall. Castillo was eventually walked by Fire 2 batters later, and the whole chagrin of the packed stadium. Cubs shortstop Alex Gonzalez misplayed an inning-ending double play, loading the bases. The error would lead to 8 Florida runs and a Miami Marlins victory, despite sending Kerry Wood to the mound and holding the lead twice. The Cubs ultimately dropped Game 7, and they failed to reach the World Series, which they could have been in there that year. The Steve Bartman incident was seen as the first domino in the turning point of the era, and the Cubs did not win another playoff game for the next 11 years. In 2004, the Cubs were a consensus pick by most media outlets to win the World Series, but the offseason acquisition of Derek Lee, who was acquired in a trade with Florida for Hee-Seop Choi, and the return of Greg Maddux only bolstered 3 expectations. Despite a mid-season deal for Nomar Garciaparra, misfortune struck the Cubs again. They led the wild card by a game and a half over the San Francisco Giants and the Houston Astros on September 25th. On that day, the both teams lost, giving the Cubs a chance at increasing the lead to 2.5 games, with only 8 games remaining in the season. But reliever Troy Hawkins blew a save to the New York Mets, and the Cubs lost the game in extra innings. But reliever Troy Hawkins, like I said, he blew the save, and the Cubs lost the game in extra innings. But the defeat seemingly deflated the team as they proceeded to drop 6 of their last 8 games, as the Houston Astros won the wild card game. Yeah, actually, I'm going to cut this short. I'll continue this next week because I'm going to try to get some medicine because I've been sick. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you want more videos like this, give me a like and subscribe. And subscribe to RBW King. You can also check out my other channel, Rusty the King, see what you like on both channels, and make sure to hit the like and subscribe, and leave a comment, send in recommendations for me, so that I can get to the videos that you guys want me to do, and I'll see you guys next week.